All right, let's test this thing, see what the sound sounds like. And I'll change the slide, see what the sound sounds like, change the slide, see what the sound sounds like. Hi folks, let's talk about the next part of your course project, which is to analyze web page design and create your own. So let's start. Web page design or website design in general is the idea of dividing a site into its different sections and then creating different types of pages in each of those sections and then assigning content to those different types of pages and then further breaking the pages down into sub areas. We'll talk about that more in just a second. So it's dividing the site. It's kind of creating the different named parts of the site, starting with pages and then breaking those pages down into areas and breaking the areas down into sub areas and making sure that all of that is nicely put together. In addition to dividing it, it's also creating a layout, figuring out what the common parts that are going to be on what each pages are, what the common parts on each pages will be, and also to figure out how those different areas change in different sections of the website. In addition, it's formatting the website, and this is what you probably usually think about as web design: the look and feel of the site, what kind of common elements there'll be on the banner, logos, that kind of thing, the colors that you'll use on the site, all that kind of stuff is the look and feel or the format of the site. And then finally, the user experience of the site, the flow of the site. What do people do first? How do they experience the site? So of those four categories, the stuff that we're gonna focus on really in this part of the project is really the division and the layout. Those are really the more structural parts of web design. Not that flow and format aren't important, it's just that we won't be talking about them here. So really we're going to be in this area of dividing the site into parts, naming all those parts, and figuring out how all the parts fit together to create a coherent site, a site where everything fits together. Okay, so let's start talking about this idea of page layout, page areas, and page sub-areas. So this you'll recognize, I hope, as a page, and I would call this a full view page. There's a full view of one item of type photograph on this page, as well as there being some navigation on the page, as well as there being a header on the page, a banner on the page, right? And then a little footer at the bottom that you can see there. Okay, so this is a page. A page is a container. And when we think about layout, the best way to think about layout is that layout is a series of nested containers, containers within containers within containers. And the top level container in a website, in a web page, is the page itself. If you think in terms of HTML, that top level container is the HTML tag. Remember, HTML is the root tag of a web page. And so that root tag, the HTML tag, is the container that contains the rest of the page. Now that's an HTML-centric view, but this really isn't about HTML, at least not yet. This is really about how this page is put together and what the parts are. So the biggest part, the top level part, is the page. The page contains everything that's on the screen, everything that's in the display. Okay, so we have a page, and now we can break that down further. And for the moment, that's as far, we're only one more level is as far as we're going to go. You can actually take this analysis down many, many levels and have sub areas, but we're really only going to focus for tonight, at least, or today, on the top level area. So we have this top level area up here. Let's call that the banner. This top level area right here, let's call that the global nav. This area over here, let's call that the content area, and the local nav area. So what we would say is that we have a page container or a page area. That's the entire page. And inside that, we have some sub areas, some sub containers, a banner, a global nav, a local nav, and a content. Now, this is sort of a stereotypical view of a page. Certainly pages that you'll find will have a different set of containers. So don't get stuck on this particular set of containers. The containers are whatever the designer decided them to be. What I'm giving you here is sort of a stereotypical or a lowest common denominator page layout. And the concept to take away immediately is that we have the top level container called the page, and inside that page we have 1, 2, 3, 4 areas. I could have broken out the footer at the bottom as a separate area, but I'm trying to keep it simple. Okay, so, and as I said, I could go into each of these areas. Like notice the content area, right? There's kind of some sophisticated layout in there, and certainly I could break that down into sub-templates, into sub-areas as well, but I won't do that for now. All right, so we have a page, That's the top level container that contains a lot of areas. We have the banner area, the global nav, local nav, and page area. All right, so I want to briefly introduce you to how this is done in HTML, not because you're going to need to do that right now, but because I want to point your nose into the future and show you that that what we're doing visually here maps to things that are technical and are done specifically in HTML for an HTML page. So you could do this layout using HTML tables. So hopefully you're familiar with the idea of an HTML table. If you're not, now's the time to stop this and go review HTML tables, because you should know them. They should be pretty, they should be among the things that you know well how to do in HTML. So a table starts with a table tag, then it has row tags. We see here that we have 2 rows in this column, 2 TRs, right? That's 2 rows, and 2 columns. You can see the columns clearly in line 7 and 8. One column says nav goes here, the other column says item goes here. TD is a cell, so we have 2 rows and 2 columns. Notice the top row spans 2 columns. If you don't understand that col span attribute, now's the time to go figure that one out. What it does is it creates the banner. The banner spans both of the columns, right? So notice we have at the top level above the table is the page. The page contains this table. Inside the table we have the top row that has the banner. Then we have the next row, and the next row is split evenly in this case between a nav area and an item area. Very simple way to do a layout using HTML tables. That's a grid. It's going to create the grid like we saw in the example. A more sophisticated way to do it, and if you know a little bit more, and by the way, this table is kind of the lowest common denominator for creating layout in the web. And if you're not so comfortable with HTML, this is the kind of way that you'll actually do it in this class. A more sophisticated way, however, is to use divs. Div stands for division, and basically the div tag just says this is an area. This is a box. All computer screen stuff is boxes, if you haven't noticed. And a div is basically an HTML way of saying this is a box. And in fact, it doesn't really say anything else than this is a box. And in this case, here's a box inside a box. So we have the header box inside the page box. We have the content box also inside the page box. And we have the nav and the item boxes inside the content boxes. So all this says right now is that I have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 boxes, and some of the boxes are inside other boxes. It doesn't say anything about where they are on the screen or how they're formatted or anything like that or what's inside them. It just says that here's the boxes. So we need another piece of, another something else besides the HTML to then put all that stuff in, like what do the boxes look like and what colors are they, what kind of borders do they have, all that kind of stuff. And that other thing that we need is CSS. CSS is a separate file from an HTML file that defines the layout and the look and feel of the HTML code. If that's not familiar to you, don't worry about it. You don't really have to know CSS for this class. If it is familiar to you, you should know that you're going to be able to use the full power of CSS that you know how to use, if you know how to use CSS. If you don't, then you'll just use that table design that I showed you before, and things will stay pretty simple. Okay, so what do I want you to know so far? I want you to be familiar with this idea of pages and page areas. And I also want you to have seen, at least, this idea that those pages and page areas are created in two different ways. One is a simple way using tables. The other is a more complex way using divs. And later on in the class, when we get to this, you'll have the choice of which way to use. Okay, so the last thing I'll do, and this may go beyond some of you guys, but I want to just put it on the table to show you the distant future in this class. And that's this idea. Notice inside here from line 4 to line 16 that I have that same div layout, that I have the same idea of the containers inside containers using divs. So from line 4 to line 16, that's all in HTML. But actually, it's an all in HTML page. But notice the entire HTML page is stuck inside of something else. The something else that it's stuck inside of is called an XSL transform. The XSL transform, as we'll see later in the course, is what actually produces web pages from an XML instance file. And so the only thing I want you to notice right now about what I'm showing you here, is the idea that it's not, in the end, for us going to be about the HTML. It's going to be about the code that creates the HTML. And here's an example of the code that creates the HTML. Not only is it creating the layout using those divs, it's also putting content into the divs. It's calling into the instance and pulling information out. When I show you on line 9,
XSL call template, the purpose of that XSL call template is to pull information out of the instance and put it into the layout. This idea of XSL transforms is a classic way of implementing something called a template. In order to create screen areas, we create a template, and that template is a standard way of specifying all the different areas on the screen, all the areas and the sub-areas and their layout. Into that layout, into that template, we paste, so to speak, content from wherever we're holding our content, in a database, in an XML file, in separate files, etc. This is the idea of separating content from design, separating information from design, separating format from structure, all ways of saying the same thing, that we put our design in one place, we put our content, our information in another place, and then when we go to build a page, we bring them both together again. Okay, so I took you out far from where we're going, where we are today, towards where we want to be in the future. Let's go back to where we are today and be very particular about what I want you to do for this exercise. You're going to complete the competitive analysis that you started in the last exercise, and then you're going to do your own site design. In both cases, this is really all about defining those pages and the page layout. What different areas are there inside of the pages of your competitor site? What different areas are there going to be in your site? So let's walk through specifically what you're going to do. Okay, so here's your competitive analysis part 1. Competitive analysis part 1 was all about information types and navigation. Remember, this is a class in information structure. The 3 big terms inside of information structure are information type, information item, and access structure. When we talk about the types, we're talking about the information types and the information items. When we talk about navigation, what we're really talking about is access structures. So you did in this analysis a very small as I could make it, analysis of the information structure of your 3 competitors' sites, focusing in on one type and trying to figure out what do they say about that type? What makes it a type? If it's a pet, what are the elements of a pet for 3 different competing sites? And then I asked you to create or to analyze one form of navigation on those sites so that you get some feeling for how are the items of type pet, for example, organized? What are the access structures? Are they using hierarchies, indexes, cross-references, or sequences? Or maybe some of each. Okay, so that was part 1. You did an analysis of the information types and a small analysis of the access structures that your competitive sites use in order to represent and organize information of the same type that you're going to represent and organize. Representation is information types and information items. Organization is access structures. That was part 1. In part 2, you're going to do a competitive analysis of the same 3 sites, but now you're going to focus on the layout of pages, specifically the layout of the full view page of the item you chose. So you have an item, you have a type, it's called pet. You have 3 sites that show pet information. Each of those sites, you're going to navigate your way to a full view of the pet information, and then you're going to do a very brief analysis. It's really a very small analysis. And what you're going to do is you're going to say, what are the areas? What are the screen areas on this full view page? Likely you'll have a banner. Likely you'll have some navigation areas, local navigation or global navigation possibly. You may have a links area on the right side that it didn't show. You may have footers. You'll certainly, and you have to have, in one way or another, you have to have a full view item area, right? An area where a full view of the item is shown. And that's what I want you to focus on. Find a page where you have the full view of an item shown, and then say, what are the areas on that screen? Block them out and show me all, say I have a banner up here, a banner area, I have a local nav area, I have a global nav area, I have a links area, I have a footer, I have the item area, and then give me some brief idea of what's going on inside that area. The purpose of this competitive analysis is for you to find at least 3 different sites, or at least 3 different layouts for a full view of your type of information so that you have something to go on. You have some experience with how other people have done layout around your kind of information type. Okay, if you're on a team and you're doing this analysis part 2, then you need to find 3 layouts, 3 full views for each of the types that you have. If you have a team of 3, then you're going to have 9 total sections. And as you can see on the side here, site number 1, site number 2, site number 3, There's a URL, and then there's a table to fill out where you name the area and then say what's inside of it. Okay, so that's your first new piece of work. In part one, you analyzed the information types and the access structures of your competitors. In part two, you're analyzing the layout. Now, we could have gone directly from analyzing the information types and the access structures to beginning to create those information types and access structures for ourselves, but you're not quite ready to do that yet. Starting next week, we'll begin on that work of working through your information types and your access structures. And while we wait for you to get that far in the material, we're going to do something that we won't actually bring into our project till much later in the quarter, which is the layout and the design of the pages that will hold those information types. But this work that you do tonight should give you a pretty good idea of where you're heading, what you're trying to get to, what your target is over the next month and a half of work. Okay, so that was thing number one to do for this exercise. Thing number two is your site design. And so here's the second document that you'll be downloading. And by the way, where you want to, well, in order to get to this, well, no, actually, well, I'll say that at the end, how you actually get to these documents. Okay, in part two of your assignment for today, you're going to do your own site design. Now, what's a site design? Very, very basically, a site design is what kind of pages you'll have on your site and what kind of areas there's going to be on those pages on your site. So the way that I've set it up is to give you sort of, again, the lowest common denominator of sites that you could create. And the lowest common denominator of sites that you could create has a home page and has one page for every full view item, right? So I have 15 pets, and my site has 16 pages, a home page and 15 pages for each of my items. The home page has one design, one layout, and the full view of a pet has another design, another layout. So I have to create two layouts, one for the item full view and one for the home page. That's the lowest common denominator. That's kind of the simplest site you can make. And in this class, that's the site that I'll expect. But of course, if you want to make a more sophisticated site, you're more than welcome to do it. So in the site design, you're going to have to come up with a design for your home page and a design for a full view page. In addition, you're going to have to come up with some sub area designs. In particular, a design for every area, a design for all four types of access structures. A design for a hierarchy, a design for an index, a design for associations, and a design for a sequence. And the easiest way to incorporate that navigational design is the way that it's done on the sample site that I gave you, the Elizabeth Robson photograph site. In that site, recall, all of those different navigational widgets, all those different navigational types, indexes, hierarchies, etc., are all in the same screen area. We have a local nav area, and that local nav area is filled with either a hierarchy or one or more indexes, or actually, and in that's all it's filled with. It's not filled with the sequence, and it's not filled with the cross-references. The sequences and cross-references happen, or associations happen otherwise. But I guess the point I want to make here is that a simple screen design that has a banner, a global nav, a local nav, and an information or an item area is sufficient to encompass all of the different kinds of navigational widgets that you might come up with. All right, so let's run through the site design doc one piece at a time, and I'll explain what I'm looking for in each of the sections. Starting with the website name. You see that it begins with a website name, so give your website some name. And then the very next thing that I ask for is the info base, the name of the info base. And so these things may be close, the name of the site versus the name of the info base, or they may be very different. I may have, and the reason I ask you for both of them is because I want you to recognize the difference between the information base and the site. The site, as I've said before, is one view of the information base. The information base is a general purpose thing. So suppose I have pets in my information base, and I have three different information types. I have cats, dogs, and hamsters. My information base might be pets. But suppose I'm using the information in my information base to get you to adopt a pet. I may be called that my information base is pets. It's all information about all these different kinds of pets. But my website is adopt a pet. Or I can make a different website from that called Pet Facts. So for people who are pet owners, all the facts about pets. The cut, the view I have, is named by the website. The general information that I have is named by the info base. Okay, so not a big deal for most of you guys. The name of your info base, and because it's such a simple system we're working on, the name of the info base and the name of the website are probably going to be pretty close. But I want you to clearly have those two things in your mind. The info base is the name of the information. What name characterizes all the information that's in my info base? And the name of the website is more the purpose of what you're using that information for. Okay, what's the name of your info type? As you see on the screen here, you just put it in. And if you have, if you're on a team, then you put in 3 or 2, however many members you have, different names there. Okay, so that should get you started. Now let's look at each of the sections. The first thing you have to do is design a home page. In the case of the sample system, I have the luxury of already being finished with it, so I can show you what the finished design looks like, and then back you into what you're going to do. What I want you to do is produce wireframes. A wireframe is just a really simplistic rendering of what you want to have, and it's just about a bunch of boxes. Remember, I talked about screen areas just being grid areas, box areas on the screen. So the easiest way to represent all of those areas is to just put a bunch of boxes together. So here's my finished design, and here's what my wireframe might look like. The wireframe simply names the different areas, and it says on this home page, I'm going to have a banner. It's going to stretch right across the screen. I'm going to have a global nav. That'll stretch right across the screen as well. And below that, I'm going to have this image rotator. If you remember, that's what's happening on the sample site is we go picture, pause, picture, pause, picture. That's called an image rotator, and it's done using JavaScript. So I call this the fancy wireframe, not because the wireframe is fancy, but because the way that I'm going to implement my home page is fancy. In other words, it's going to require JavaScript. So you, in your work, may not feel comfortable using JavaScript and creating something as fancy as this image rotator control. So I have another one, which is a simple one. Again, not simple wireframe, but simple approach to a home page. This simple approach to a home page has the same banner and global nav as the other one, but now in this case we have a grid full of pictures. So instead of having the image rotator, which is hard to implement, I have this picture, 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 picture idea, which is a lot easier to implement, a lot easier to make happen. And the image, image, image has the title of the image, followed by the image itself, followed by first sentence of the description, followed by a link to a full view page for that image, right, for that photograph. Okay, so what you would say, the way you would describe this in our vocabulary is that we have a banner, a global nav, and then under the global nav we have partial views of the photo items of this system. And if I click on one of the partial views, I go to the full view for the same item. Okay, so it's simple in the sense that you will easily be able to create something like this using what I teach you in the class. I'm not teaching you about JavaScript, so the image rotator would not be as easy to create. Okay, so that's the home page. So let me give you some constraints on the home page. What I want to see on your home page, I think it says, I think I say at least 4 areas, at least 4 different areas, or 3 areas, I can't remember which. You can look in the document and find that. And that you have to have some set of partial views on that home page. So the second wireframe that I showed you is an example of one that has partial views on the home page. In fact, the first one I showed you also has partial views on the home page. They're just very partial. It's just the photograph, 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 photograph in an image rotator. That counts as a partial view. So what I want you to do is design a home page. This is lowest common denominator. Design a home page that has at least 3 areas, and I think that's what I say in the document, at least 3 areas, and has some representation of item partial views on it. Okay, now if you're a team, create one home page for the whole team, but your home page might be more, will be more complicated than a single item home page. In the single item home page, what I showed you is really easy to accomplish. You just put in partial views for your item type on that home page and you're done. But what happens if you have 3 information types? Are you going to put in partial views for all 3 different information types? That's a possibility. But what's more likely is that you'll want the home page to span all the information types, and you're going to want to create some kind of sub pages, sub home pages that have the full views of all the items of that type. Now, I'm not saying that that's definitely what you want to do, but that's the direction that you'll go. So In general, and you'll see me say this a few more times before I get to the end here, in general, if you're working on a team, your site design is going to be more complicated, as well it should, right? A site that has 3 information types on it is more complicated than a site that has 1 information type on it. If you have 3 information types on in your team, then 1 home page for the entire 3 different information types, and then you may very well have to put together separate home pages for each information type, or figure out some other way to do it. Whatever you do, it needs to make sense, and it needs to be one single consolidated site across the 2 or 3 information types if you're a team. Okay, let's go on to an item full view page. Remember, what you're doing in this assignment is you're going to create a home page design, an item full view page design, and a design for each of your navigational structures. And each navigational structure links to a different access structure. Okay, so again, I have the advantage of having a finished page to show you, but what you'll create is something more like this. It's a page that has the item full view embedded in it. Oops, one more thing. There we go. Okay, so notice I have the basic page layout, which is what I showed you earlier: banner, global nav, local nav, and item area, content area, whatever you want to call that. Inside the item area or the content area, I further have described what a full view is going to look like. I did a little sketch of the full view. In this case, I said it's going to have an item title. I forgot to put in picture there. Obviously, it's going to have the picture, a description, and other item data, and then below that, related photos. Right? That's a kind of a caricature or a prototype or a wireframe of the full view of one item of type photo, embedded inside of a page design. The page design has banner, global nav, local nav, and item. I go into more detail on the item view. I really don't need to go into more detail at this point about the banner, the global nav, or the local nav. Okay, so for now, I'm going to just put a block diagram together of my item full view page, and that's what you'll be doing as well. For each item full view page, for each item type that you have in your project, you have to create one wireframe of the page design for that type. So if you're working alone, that means one design, a design of the page that hosts full views of your item type. If you have 3 people on your team, then you're going to have to create 3 page designs, one for each item type. And of course, if you have 3 people on your team and you're creating 3 separate designs, those designs have to relate to each other. You don't want them to be vastly different designs. If you went to a website and you clicked on one type of information and you got one page design, you click on another type of information and the page design is completely different, you're going to think that that's kind of a crazy site. You want some coherence between the presentation or the layout or the design of the pages for each information type. So once again, if you're working in a team, you have to consolidate your work so that everybody's work looks like everybody else's work. It's trying to make one thing out of many things. Okay, so I think the other constraints on the full view pages are that you don't go into detail about any of the areas except the item area. And inside the item area, as I just showed you, put some detail in. Now notice it's not a lot of detail. It's a sketch. It's a top-level diagram of what you think is going to go there, just to get your mind wrapped around what your pages are going to look like. So notice we've done the minimum amount of design here. We've designed the home page and we've designed an item full view page. And that's pretty much the basic website. It's got a home page and it's got one page for every item of every type on the site. And if I have a one type site, it's got an item for one type. If I got a 3 type site, it's got a page for or a page design for every different information type. Okay, so we've designed the home page, we've designed the full view page. One more thing I want you to do, and that's design the navigation areas. Okay, so here there's some work to do before you go into that design. Look around at your competitor sites and see how they did it, right? That was the point of doing that part of the assignment. But now think, before you do this, think hard about each of the different access structures. What's a logical way to put all of the items together in an outline? And that would be a hierarchy. So these are thinking things, right? This is not just something that you slap down on a piece of paper. You really have to consider this in order to make it work right. What's the most logical way to put all my items in an outline? That's your hierarchy. What alphabetical or numerical lists make sense for all the items of my information type. Now, I'll talk about teams in a minute, but let's just deal with the simple case of I have a single information type. I'm going to create a single hierarchy. It's going to have all my items in it. What hierarchy should that be? Should it be a locational hierarchy? Should it be a subject hierarchy? What kind of hierarchy fits my information? What kind of alphabetical or numerical lists fit my information? Second, third, how am I going to link one item directly to other items? That's my accusations. How I got that word in there, I don't know. It's supposed to say associations. That's my associations, linking one item to the other. How is one item related to another item? That's how I'm going to do my associations. And in what order do I want people to consume my items? That's my sequence, either all the items or some subset of the items. Sequences tend to be the hardest part, and if you don't get the sequence right off the bat, we'll have some time to talk about it, and I'll work with you to get you to the right sequence. Of all four, sequences tend to give students the most trouble. There's not always a natural sequence that fits your information, and the idea of a sequence seems to be the hardest one for students to cotton on to. So but to begin, think that a sequence is an ordered list. And what order is it? The order I want you to see them, not the order that they are if I sort them alphabetically or numerically. You want them to look at the first one first, the second one second, the third one third. That's what makes it a sequence. Okay, so before I begin this, I'm going to think. Now, if I am in a team, I have some additional things to think about. So at the very least, if you have three information types, there should be a way to associate, that's access structure number 3, to associate items of one type to items of another type. That's just the definition of them all being in the same system. They're all in the same system because there's some relationship between type 1 and type 2, right? An item of type 1, say you have teachers and students, right? My first information type is teachers. My second information type is students. How are students and teachers related? Well, a teacher teaches a set of students, right? And so I'll have links from the teacher to that teacher's students, or links from the student to the student's teachers. There's some relationship between those two different types of information. Otherwise, there's no point in having them in the same system. And so that's the very least you should do concerning the navigation for a multi-team member site. I have more than one information type. I have to figure out how to associate one information type, items of one information type, to items of the other information types. Okay, so that's the minimum to say that I have a coherent, an information base where all of my items make sense in relation to all the other items that are in there. You can go further if you figure out ways to do it. For example, you can create a hierarchy that has more than one information type in it. Items from 2 or 3 different information types. If you can figure that out, fine. If you can't, then you have to create separate hierarchies for each of the types. So it's not better or worse necessarily to have a hierarchy that has all your information types in it, all your information items in it of all your types. But if you can figure that out, go for it and try it out. So the minimum number of hierarchies you'll have is 1 because it contains all of your different types. The maximum is the number of team members, 2 if you have 2 team members, 3 if you have 3 team members. And the same thing goes for indexes and sequences. If you can find a sequence that includes more than one type of information, great. If you can't, then create individual sequences for each of them. Okay, in the end, each type of information has to be in 4 structures. It has to participate in an index, a sequence, a hierarchy, and associations. And that's what I'll look for when I check you out on this. Okay, let's go through the different kinds of nav areas, and I'll show you what I have in the prototype and what a wireframe would look like. So here's my finished prototype on the left-hand side, and my wireframe on the right-hand side. Notice that the wireframe doesn't deal with, it really is a sketch, and it's just giving the idea of how stuff is going to be basically laid out and organized. And in this case, I just give you the idea that it's some expanding and contracting list, right, with the plus and the minus signs, and that I have 3 levels in my hierarchy, and that there are items at the lowest level. Now, here's something to think about with the hierarchy particularly, and that is that if it doesn't have more than 2 levels, then it's not a hierarchy. Let's count the levels in this hierarchy. I have USA at the top, East Coast at level 2, and New York at level 3. So this one has 3 levels of hierarchy, and then the items are at the 3rd level. It doesn't really matter that you only have items at the 3rd level. You can have items at the other levels as well. What matters is that you have at least 2 levels. If it just said USA and then a bunch of items, Asia and a bunch of items, that wouldn't be a hierarchy. It's a hierarchy for our purposes if it has at least two levels. Now, I don't count the title. Photos by location is not a level of the hierarchy. USA is the first level of the hierarchy. Okay, so that's what you should do in order to make sure that your hierarchy fits my criteria. Okay, now we can look at an index, and notice the index actually sort of looks like a hierarchy, but notice only one level in the index, and that's why it's not a hierarchy. Also, it's alphabetized, whereas the hierarchy is not alphabetized. Okay, so the finished one that I have in my head that I'm thinking I want to create, and then the wireframe that shows me how I think that navigation area with an index is going to work. Okay, and then if you remember from the sample site, the sequence that I have is a pretty fancy sequence. It has this pop-up, and inside the pop-up it has all sorts of controls and a nice big partial view of the item, right? And this is how I might wireframe that. I can do a lot simpler, so it's fancy in the sense that it's a fancy approach to a sequence. I can do a lot simpler one and just say I have a slideshow and it goes image, 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 and that's going to be my sequence. And the idea here is I want the user to click on the top left one first and the bottom right one last. That's the sequence. I don't really intend them to click randomly in this sequence. I intend them to click from the first one to the second one. So I might actually even put one image on there with a forward and a back arrow, a next and a previous arrow, so that they can't randomly go through because I really, really want them to click on them in order. The point here, however, is I'm going to wireframe my sequence so that it shows what I intend and what I think my sequence is going to look like in the long run. Okay, and then finally, association. Here's a fancy one. This is a fancy one from the sample system. This is an item. Europe Lewis is an item of type narrative, if you remember, or we might have called it a story or an article. And within it is a link to an item of type photograph. This boxed area inside the finished one on the left here is actually a link. It's an association. It's a cross-reference to a different item. Inside item A, I have a link to item B. Notice this link crosses information types. It links a narrative or an article type to a photo type. And so it's a candidate for the kind that you might have if you're in a team, linking across information types. Notice also that the link itself, the association itself, is kind of complicated. The association consists of the photo title, and a piece of the photo description. That I would call a partial view of the associated item. So the way that I wireframe this is to say I have the title of the item, some text, and then embedded inside the text is a partial view of the associated item. That's what I'm showing on the right-hand side of the screen. And the partial view consists of an item, a title, and the first paragraph of the description. So I've now wireframed the thing that I have in my mind, the idea that I want to embed a partial view smack dab in the middle of an item of a different type. Okay, that's associations. I'm associating one item to another directly, and in this case I'm using a fancy technique. I can use a much simpler technique and just take all of my links, all of my associations, and put them in a little bullet list, and here's what the wireframe of that would look like. I just have the title of the item, some text, and then a little box that has an A tag with the title of each item that I've linked to. Okay, so what I've gone through is the navigation, and what I expect from you in the navigation. You can't give me pictures of the finished one because you're not going to be finished to the end of the quarter. However, you can give me pictures of the wireframes, and you can paste a picture of your wireframe of each type of navigation into the document that I've provided, and then you can, and then you'll have a visual specification of your ending website. So to conclude, you're going to put together a site design that includes a home page, item full views with the item itself shown in wireframe form, and then wireframes of each of the 4 types of access structures that you're going to implement somewhere on your website.